2004 marked a major turning point in my life. My family had moved us from Philadelphia to North Florida, and I would spend years afterwards trying to adjust to the new locale and school system, and one of the major hurdles was making new friends. The difficulties I faced in socializing with my classmates as a 9-year-old were only compounded further by the culture shock and my own then recently diagnosed attention deficit disorder. While I had trouble making friends with my classmates, I did quickly become chummy with a few of the neighbor kids. We would do the typical kid stuff of the time, both indoors and out, but it was on a brisk day that November when the 16-year-old brother of one of these neighborhood friends brought home a new game for his Xbox. I was hardly familiar with the console, having only seen it once or twice when I was still in Philly, but the game he showed us would end up changing my life. And that game was Halo 2. For hours, 3 of us would try to beat him in games of Slayer, Juggernaut, and Oddball. All of us gathered on the bottom bunk in a cramped bedroom while staring up at a 12-inch CRT. We would never beat him, but I was still ecstatic at the opportunity to play more Halo all the same. I had never played or even heard of first-person shooters, and Halo 2 was, at the time, the most beautiful game I had ever played, with controls that were smooth and intuitive, even for a 9-year-old. I would also play bits and pieces of the campaigns for both Halos at my friends' houses, and eventually acquire a secondhand copy of the first novel, Eric Nyland's The Fall of Reach, which I read several times before I even entered junior high school. It would be Christmas of 2007 when I would receive an Xbox 360, and I would use my Christmas money to buy Halo 3 a few days after. In August 2008, I would acquire the first 2 Halos for myself, as well as access to Xbox Live, finally allowing me to play this revolutionary series online with other players. I had to relocate my 360 to the spare bedroom in order to connect it to the router, and I had to use a 7-inch portable DVD player as a display, but I didn't mind. It was far from an ideal setup, but when you're 13, you'll do anything to play more Halo. Even in school, I would find ways to satiate my love for this series, usually by reading the books during free periods and following tests and quizzes. This franchise and its community would help to spur me into the creative arts. I would use Halo 3, ODST, and Reach as creative outlets by producing machinima during my high school years, and it was through putting together these crude animations as a teenager that my passion for writing and filmmaking would flourish. And it was at the start of my senior year of high school that Halo 4 would be released, the first mainline Halo title not to be developed by Bungie, but by 343 Industries, the new custodians of the franchise. It was the first game for which I attended a midnight release, where I purchased the limited edition of the game, and I ultimately stayed up until 3 a.m. on a school night to play at least some of its campaign and multiplayer, despite needing to wake up at 6 to get ready for school. But unlike Halo 3 and Reach, which I had played consistently for years following their releases, I had dropped off of Halo 4 within only a few months, and based on some old population graphs, I was far from the only one. Its multiplayer wasn't as strong as previous titles, being centered around customizable player loadouts which broke the game in half, and even though today this is a non-issue on the Master Chief Collection, I still find Halo 4 multiplayer to be less enjoyable than its forebears. But this video isn't about the multiplayer, or 343's mediocre attempt at a synthesis of story and multiplayer in Spartan Ops, but rather Halo 4's main campaign. Whereas my friends and I had gone back to replay the campaigns of 3, ODST, and Reach time and time again, we never went back to Halo 4's campaign, either individually or as a group. It had a decidedly different tone from what had come before, and while I remember liking parts of it, I faintly recall a feeling of being underwhelmed, and the community consensus appears to be somewhat mixed to boot. But it's been nearly a decade since then, and I'm no longer a high school senior, but a college graduate with a degree in film, and as of last year, Halo 4 and all that came before it are now available on PC as part of the Master Chief Collection. So with Halo Infinite's campaign fast approaching, I decided to go back and reassess 343 Industries' inaugural title in the franchise they inherited. More specifically, I wished to reassess the campaign and story of Halo 4. Was it truly a disappointment, unworthy of the Halo name and destined to be condemned? Or was it a worthwhile, albeit flawed chapter in the saga? No piece of media exists in a bubble, and Halo is no exception. Each entry in the franchise was a product of its time, and to fully understand them, one must attempt to examine them through a contemporary lens. Before Bungie's Halo Combat Evolved was released as a launch title for the Xbox in 2001, conventional industry wisdom posited that first-person shooters simply did not and could not ever work properly on a console. While there were outliers, namely copious ports of id Software's Doom, most of which saw some sort of technical compromise, and Rareware's GoldenEye and Perfect Dark for the Nintendo 64, such games were marred by the inaccuracy of directional buttons and analog sticks. Halo wasn't originally planned as a console game, or as a first-person shooter, but as a real-time strategy game for Windows PCs that would eventually become a third-person shooter, then a first-person shooter, before Bungie was purchased by Microsoft to turn it into a launch title for their upcoming Xbox console. Despite low expectations from industry analysts and Microsoft themselves, Halo would ultimately prove to be the Xbox's killer app, thanks to a plethora of innovations and refinements made to controls, gameplay, enemy AI, and level design. Regenerating shields, dedicated melee and grenade buttons, a two-weapon system, and subtle auto-aim were the most significant aspects of Halo, which kept players coming back to both its campaign, which was praised for its cinematic presentation and a soundtrack which, at the time, was compared to that of a feature film, and its multiplayer suite, which could be enjoyed by 4 players on a single console, or by 16 players over System Link. There simply weren't any other games like Halo at the time, and soon after, games in the genre would take cues from Bungie's Golden Child. As Bungie continued work on the franchise, Halo developed a reputation for being an innovator. In 2004, Halo 2 would introduce playlist-based online matchmaking, along with a host of social features, which Microsoft and Sony would adopt as part of the basis for their 7th-generation online networks. It was also the premier title for Xbox Live, being the most played title on the service until the release of Gears of War for the Xbox 360 in November 2006, but continued to be one of the most played games on the service until legacy servers were brought offline in 2010. So massive was the popularity of Halo 2's multiplayer that it would be the first video game to have competitive matches aired live on ESPN. In 2007, Halo 3 would bring to the table community features such as a rudimentary but intuitive map editor, expanded custom game options, a theater mode, and a file share for players to share their creations with others. But despite the massive, records-shattering launches these games would enjoy, 2007 would also cement the foothold of Activision's multi-platform Call of Duty franchise, with that year's entry, subtitled Modern Warfare, outselling Halo 3 and becoming the best-selling game of the year. Since then, Call of Duty has become a franchise with annualized releases developed by a rotation of 2, later 3 development studios, with the franchise hitting a new peak in 2009, with the release of Modern Warfare smashing entertainment records once again. Meanwhile, Halo, while not having fallen out of favor with players, was starting to see some shakeups. Bungie had already announced their departure from Microsoft in 2007, and would develop 2 more titles to fulfill their contractual obligations. Halo 3 ODST was a standalone expansion for Halo 3 not featuring the Master Chief, nor a dedicated multiplayer component, but rather a cooperative wave defense mode a la Gears of War 2's Horde mode. And Halo Reach was a prequel to Combat Evolved which saw notable gameplay changes, but little in the way of innovation, instead opting to be a celebration of Bungie's time with the franchise by bringing together everything they had done in previous entries and expanding on them. The games reviewed well, but reactions from fans, while generally positive, erred towards disappointment in some regards. as Reach in particular had begun to stray away from Halo's core multiplayer ethos, causing a rift in the community. With Bungie leaving Halo behind, custodianship of the franchise would be turned over to 343 Industries, an internal development studio Microsoft started for the explicit purpose of continuing the Halo franchise, poaching talent from all over the video game industry, including some from Bungie themselves. Their first release would be 2011's Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary, a graphical remaster of the original Halo, released exactly 10 years to the day for a reduced price of $40. While the ability to swap between classic and remastered graphics modes in-game with the press of a single button was impressive, some fans were displeased with the apparent slapdash nature of the remastered visuals, with many of its assets being lifted directly from Reach, and myriad small issues regarding level geometry, collision, art direction, and art design would ultimately lead to a tepid reception. But Anniversary was not the only project 343 announced at E3 2011. At the end of Microsoft's press conference, a teaser would reveal that Halo 4 was in development and slated for a 2012 release window. Expectations were understandably high, but there was very much an air of skepticism from some corners of the fanbase. Could this development team deliver an experience on par with Bungie's titles? Or were they simply going to milk Microsoft's star child for all it was worth? Fans would judge for themselves on November 6, 2012. It doesn't take terribly long to get a sense of why players felt the game was underwhelming from a gameplay standpoint. The way the game controls is fantastic and feels true to what Halo is, but the problems lie in everything surrounding those controls. While the original 4 Covenant enemy types, grunts, jackals, elites, and hunters, are all here and act more or less how they did before, their behavior isn't quite as robust as in previous titles. This may have been due to a push for graphical fidelity, as there's an expectation that video game sequels improve on their predecessors from a visual standpoint. But the Xbox 360 was 7-year-old hardware when Halo 4 was released, with its anemic successor not due for another year. It's very possible that system resources were allocated more towards the game's graphics than enemy AI, leading to enemies not being quite as interesting to fight as in previous installments. While Halo 4 is beautiful, especially when considering the hardware, I don't think fans would have minded if 343 had pulled back a bit on the visuals for the sake of having more robust enemies to fight. Despite this, encounters against the Covenant can still be fun. They do occasionally exhibit some of those more advanced and unique behaviors from past titles, and retain the same general personalities. If nothing else, they're consistent with what came before. The same cannot be said for the new Promethean enemies, the Crawler, the Watcher, and the Knight. When fought as a group, they synergize very well, but that synergy is what makes them tedious to combat. Watchers fly around the battlefield, catch player grenades, raise hard light shields for their allies, and are capable of reviving their fallen allies, meaning that dispatching any other enemy in a skirmish may end up being a waste of time, meaning players had best prioritize killing the Watchers. But because they're airborne, melee isn't a consistent option, and grenades are out of the question because they catch them, meaning they can only be shot. Crawlers have little health and as such are as easy to kill as a grunt in theory, but their agility makes them likely to avoid your grenades, leaving shooting and melee as the only real viable options. And the Knights have incredibly strong melee attacks, making close quarters encounters with them far too dangerous, especially considering their high defenses. Their ability to teleport without warning means grenades, while effective at times, aren't a consistent option, leaving medium to long-range fire as the only pragmatic solution, which becomes tedious due to their aforementioned defenses making them bullet sponges, as well as their teleportation not only delaying the inevitable, but also presenting the player with a move they can't counter. This is especially frustrating when the Knight teleports behind you and gets a free kill with its melee. The Prometheans, intentionally or not, restrict Halo's sandbox, as each of them practically forbids the use of one of Halo's 3 main pillars of combat, with Halo 4's attempt at making armor abilities into a 4th pillar leaving as much of an impression as a Pidgey on Route 1. Moreover, their synergy in combat leads to players tackling encounters with them in mostly the same way every time. Kill the Watchers, then the Crawlers, then the Knights, usually all from a distance with a light rifle. This becomes even more frustrating whenever the latter two have power weapons, which often can't be easily discerned due to the minor variations between their ranks. This is compounded by just how powerful their power weapons are, specifically the binary rifle and incineration cannon, which are instant kills. In a GDC talk, former Bungie employee and lead game designer on the first 3 Halos, Jamie Griesmer, discussed how weapons need to be balanced not just for the player to use, but to be used against them. The plasma rifle, for example, was able to be dodged at times with particular movement. The sniper rifle had the amount of time between shots increased from 0.5 seconds to 0.7 seconds between Halos 2 and 3, so the defending player could have just a bit more time to register what's happening to them and react. But these Promethean power weapons, at least when used by the AI, don't feel like they had players in mind when they were designed. Sometimes the binary rifle's targeting beam will present itself, but usually it won't. And knights that carry incineration cannons do glow and have their faces outlined in orange, but from a distance these details are almost unnoticeable, and if you're close enough to notice, it's likely far too late to react or get behind cover. I bring this up first because I don't have as much to say about Halo 4's gameplay, but I believe it's worth including as part of the conversation, as Halo's gameplay is what historically has kept players coming back to both the campaign and multiplayer. Moreover, discussion of a video game necessitates talking about its controls. After all, it is an interactive medium. Both frustrating enemy types, lackluster AI, and additions to the weapon sandbox that run the gamut from useless to redundant to overpowered, it's not hard to understand why the gameplay was contentious, even if the way the game generally controls is true to the series' roots. But it's not Halo 4's gameplay that I was looking forward to revisiting. It was the story. Halo 4's story isn't difficult to summarize. In fact, it can be done with only 2 sentences. The Master Chief emerges from cryosleep over a Forerunner planet where he unwittingly releases an ancient Forerunner warlord who seeks to destroy humanity as penance for their ancestors' transgressions. The Chief has to stop him while also trying to help bring Cortana back to her creator to find a solution for her neural degradation. There's obviously more to it than that, but it's a simple enough plot on its own that expands on the universe through the introduction of a living Forerunner character after 3 games of them being extinct and survived only by their constructs, weapons, and AI, while also exploring the nature of artificial intelligence in this world, and putting the Master Chief into a situation where he's mostly on his own. The heart and soul of Halo's story is the relationship between the Master Chief and Cortana, his one constant companion through the original trilogy from beginning to end. The ghost in his shell, as it were. A machine made to seem more human, in contrast to the Chief being a human molded to act like a machine. It's Cortana's rampancy, the end-of-life decay that all smart AI such as herself experience after 7 years of service, that acts as the inciting incident which sparks both of their character arcs. Over the course of the campaign, Cortana slips up, says things she doesn't mean, loses control of herself, and falls deeply into an internal cacophony of her own thoughts. Further blurring the lines between human and construct is how her condition is treated both by characters within the narrative and by those who crafted it.
And on a personal note, at the beginning of Halo 4, my mother was diagnosed with dementia. And over the course of the production of the game, I watched her deteriorate as a human being and become someone that I couldn't even recognize. And that was really hard, but it was also an inspiration to me to want to tell Cortana's story.
Cortana's story was coming from a place of grief, from real, personal experience with somebody losing control of themselves and being completely helpless to do anything about it. Whereas before she was the cooler head that would analyze the situation and point the Chief, and by proxy the player, to where they needed to go and what they had to do, now she can barely keep a single thought straight. This informs the Chief's character arc, as now their roles have been reversed. He has to take charge of the mission now and keep Cortana focused on what they have to do. This is highlighted best during the penultimate mission, Composer, with a callback to the opening cutscene of the original Halo's final level.
This thing is falling apart!
It'll hold.
We're not gonna make it!
We'll make it.
Pull up! Pull up! You did that on purpose, didn't you?
I need you to protect that artifact until we arrive. Send whatever...
Do you know what that condescending bitch said to me after our first game of chess?
Cortana.
Even I don't call him by name anymore.
Correct your approach.
Yes, well, he also said he works better alone. I can see why you chose him, Catherine.
Cortana.
I'm your greatest achievement and you detest
Pull up. Now!
And with Cortana's extreme struggle to do something as simple as locate the scientists in charge of a space station, a moment where the Master Chief acts on his responsibility to take care of her in a way that would have been almost unthinkable in previous games in the series.
I can't believe he did that.
Cortana, I need that info. Look, don't think about the Didad. Don't think about the composer. Only focus on finding me Tilson.
Tilson. Sandra Kay. Female, 51 years of age. Doctor of Archaeology. Pegasi Institute. Got her! Biosignature stable on 350 level. B deck.
Thank you, Cortana.
The Chief thanking her is the cherry on top. It's a small gesture, but it's something he's never done before now, and it compounds with his patient and earnest attempts to help anchor her during a rampant episode. The Chief has always treated Cortana as more than just a machine, but here he treats her as though she is truly human, and he does so in a way that is also human, thus further blurring those lines between man and machine. It's this question of whether the Chief is man or machine that permeates Halo 4's story. It is the main theme, and it's not subtle about it.
My work saved the human race.
Do you think the Spartans' lack of basic humanity helped? Do you believe the Master Chief succeeded because he was, at his core, broken?
Your mistake is seeing Spartans as military hardware.
Before this is all over, promise me you'll figure out which one of us is the machine.
And soldiers aren't machines. We're just people.
She said that to me once. About being a machine.
But paying lip service to a theme would be shallow, and thankfully Halo 4 actually explores the Chief's humanity in a manner which doesn't come off quite so heavy-handedly. But first, we must address the function of the Chief in past games. Simply put, he was created as a vessel for the player above all else. He wouldn't talk during gameplay, only during cutscenes, and even then, he wasn't the one really driving the plot or making decisions. He was a soldier. He only ever followed orders. But in Halo 4, the Chief speaks frequently during gameplay, and begins making his own decisions regarding what he needs to do to protect humanity. The ending even sums up what he believes to be his purpose in life.
Our duty as soldiers is to protect humanity, whatever the cost.
And it's this philosophy which informs the decisions he makes. It's why he disobeys Captain Del Rio's orders to surrender Cortana when she's clearly going off the deep end. It's why he's willing to destroy the Composer and all the data humanity has gathered from researching it. And it's why he's ready to manually detonate a nuclear bomb to defeat the Didact with no hope of surviving the blast.
Whatever the cost.
But as Lasky points out, the Chief's thinking is flawed. The Chief has, knowingly or not, separated himself from humanity, othered himself as a tool, a machine. And to many returning players, they probably had seen the Master Chief as the player Cypher he was conceived to be, claiming that he had no character to speak of in Bungie's original trilogy, and that Halo 4 betrays or misunderstands the utilitarian nature of the character. But this would be untrue. The Chief did have some character to him in the original games. Sure, he was a stoic badass who was absolutely dedicated to completing the mission, and it's not like he suddenly isn't that in Halo 4. But that's not the beginning and end of his character. He had a dry, albeit limited, sense of humor. He cares about the lives of the soldiers around him. He doesn't like being in the spotlight. There's an argument to be made that he's merciful, judging by his brief interaction with, funny enough, the Prophet of Mercy. He had a good rapport with both the Arbiter and Johnson, being visibly upset by the latter's death. He was confident in using some pretty out there tactics, and if we include the extended canon, there's even more to glean, but more on that subject later. The most significant element in discerning the Chief's personality from prior titles, however, is also what Halo 4's story is built around: his relationship with Cortana. What starts as a mostly obligatory relationship, with the Chief needing to protect her from the Covenant boarding the Pillar of Autumn, becomes something more tightly knit. This can be seen in Halo 2 when he hesitates at her request to be left aboard High Charity, and most explicitly throughout Halo 3 through the Cortana messages and his mission to rescue her from the flood-infested Holy City. What clenches this is their final moments in Halo 3, both before the Arc portal closes.
If we don't make it,
We'll make it.
it's been an honor serving with you, John.
And after they've been marooned in deep space.
I miss you.
Wake me when you need me.
Leaving just these two alone at the end of Halo 3 also helps to inform the decision to explore their characters in Halo 4 through each other. As in 343's inaugural outing, the two of them are alone on and around Requiem for the entire first act. Thankfully, Halo 4 also develops the Chief through his interactions with other characters, who reflect different aspects of his life, as well as those who have long since passed. Through Cortana, we explore the Chief's humanity, but once the Infinity enters the picture, his identity and duty as a soldier are challenged. It's at the end of the first act of the campaign that the UNSC Infinity is brought into the fold of the narrative, and along with it Spartan 4 Commander Sarah Palmer, Commander Thomas Lasky, and Captain Andrew Del Rio. While Palmer is mostly a non-entity in Halo 4's story, only following orders and never driving the action, not unlike the Chief himself in the Bungie trilogy, Del Rio and Lasky act as mirror images of each other. Before the player even meets Del Rio, they are already given an impression of the sort of commanding officer he is. He sends the two commanders on a scouting run while the ship is under attack, which would have led to their deaths had the Master Chief not arrived in time. And after meeting him, he still gives a poor impression. He prioritizes quick and dirty methods of operation when forward reconnaissance and gathering intel would have saved dozens of lives. He puts saving his own skin above stopping the Didact, actively disregarding the Chief as little more than a relic of a bygone war despite the Spartan having saved his ship, and finished the Captain's poorly planned blow-through op almost single-handedly. And sure, there is certainly an argument to be had regarding whether Del Rio's priorities were well advised from a military perspective.
This is a first contact scenario, Master Chief. Priority is to free Infinity from Requiem's gravity well and file a threat assessment back at FleetCom.
But framing matters here, and he's framed as a somewhat vain and incompetent captain.
I don't know about you, but I usually like a little more intel with my intel.
And with all due respect to you, soldier, I'm not willing to jeopardize my ship because of the hallucinations of an aging Spartan and his malfunctioning AI.
So what does Del Rio have to do with the Chief's character arc? Well, to answer that, we have to look back at Chief's commanding officers from the Bungie games. In Combat Evolved, it was Captain Keyes, a well-meaning man who was like a father to his men. Keyes would follow protocol when necessary, but wouldn't always play by the book. He drew the Covenant's fire from the Autumn's life pods by setting the ship on a collision course with Halo while he was still on board, but only did so after the rest of the crew had been evacuated. He wouldn't stand back while the Marines did all the work. He would take to the field and brandish a weapon alongside them. He would berate the Chief and Cortana for their recklessness, but offer sincere thanks for doing so in the same breath. His voice actor, Pete Stacker, imbued Keyes with authority, but also tinges of weariness, showing that he's been at this for a while, and the war has truly begun to weigh heavily on him, and yet he kept going as he always had, never abandoning his principles. And like the Chief, he laments the very idea of leaving anybody behind, as evident during his brief appearance towards the end of Halo Reach.
Lieutenant, get aboard! We gotta get the hell out of here!
Negative. I have the gun. Good luck, sir.
Good luck to you, Spartan.
While Keyes' appearance in the games are scarce, there's enough there that his character is well defined in the mind of the player to make it upsetting when they find that he's been assimilated by the Flood. In Halo 2, we got his daughter, Commander Miranda Keyes, who was nowhere near as experienced as her father and was far more reckless, but she still had the same respect and trust for everyone under her command. She and Lord Hood in Halos 2 and 3 act like two halves of Captain Keyes, with Miranda embodying her father's recklessness and drive, and Hood representing the almost father-like authority that Miranda sometimes lacks. But all three of them have humanity's best interests at heart and, most importantly for the player, a respect for the Master Chief's skill, ability, and judgment.
Ship that size. Not on your own.
Sir, permission to leave the station.
For what purpose, Master Chief?
To give the Covenant back their bomb.
Permission granted.
I'll find Cortana's solution, and I'll bring it back.
Earth is all we have left. You trust Cortana that much?
Sir. Yes, sir.
This is either the best decision you've ever made or the worst. Hell of it is, Chief. I doubt I'll live long enough to find out which.
Del Rio is not that. He does things seemingly only by the book, doesn't take the counsel of others into account, and most significantly for the player, doesn't respect the Chief, at least not entirely. While Del Rio certainly respects the Chief's abilities, he doesn't care to listen to his counsel, nor does he seem to hold him in high regards as a person, only as a tool, a machine.
I saw. And with all due respect to you, soldier, I'm not willing to jeopardize my ship because of the hallucinations of an aging Spartan.
The Chief, at least in the games, has never had to contend with such a seemingly incompetent commanding officer. He's never been treated solely as a tool to be used for battle by either of the two Keys or Lord Hood. He's never had his suggestions turned down with such implicit hostility. And it's not as though the Chief ever did anything to antagonize Del Rio. Del Rio is just a dick. And that's the point. I've seen some fans criticize Del Rio for being unlikable or for merely being an obstacle in the plot, but that's the point. He's not supposed to be embraced by fans like past characters in his position, otherwise he would have still been captain by the end of the story. As for an obstacle, well, yes, he is. That's the point. He's an important stepping stone in the Master Chief's character arc. It's through his interactions with Del Rio that the Chief's submission to authority is tested. When the Chief knows there's a greater threat needing to be stopped, and there's an opportunity at hand to do just that, how does he handle his CO putting their foot down and denying such action in favor of abandoning the fight? At first, he relents like a good soldier, leading to Del Rio delivering this underappreciated line.
You know, I think you, of all people, would appreciate the benefit of living to fight another day.
The line itself is nothing spectacular, but what makes it poignant is the context and how it's used. Remember, the Master Chief sees himself, a soldier, as being separate from humanity, and he's dedicated to his duty to protect humanity. With this one line, Del Rio hits on a point that the Chief had possibly never even considered before now: self-preservation. With how willing he's been to throw himself into the heat of battle and take insane risks to protect humanity, his confidence in such ludicrously over-the-top strategies has been slightly reframed. I have no doubt that the Chief had done this stuff in the past because he thought he could live through it, given there was still a war on and he was one of the last best hopes for humanity's survival. But now there's an undercurrent of self-sacrifice being retroactively applied to these acts to some degree, intentionally or not.
Whatever the cost.
This also slightly reframes his assurance to Cortana at the end of Halo 3. Does he really believe they'll make it through the portal, or is he just trying to put her mind at ease? Is he confident the fight is finished when he leans back, or is he accepting the possibility of death?
Whatever the cost.
Self-preservation is not uniquely human, but it is a behavior of sentient beings, which humans are. This brief moment furthers Halo 4's themes by subtly calling the Chief's humanity into question by interrogating the importance he places on his own life, and doing this with a character the player is meant to dislike. A character who supposedly is placing his own life over his duty to protect humanity highlights this discrepancy. It makes Del Rio a fantastic foil for the Chief, and it also begs the question that was posed to Dr. Halsey in Halo 4's infamous opening cinematic. Is the Master Chief so good at what he does because he is fundamentally broken? But the real test of the Chief's resolve comes after the campaign's 5th mission, when Del Rio is prepping Infinity to leave Requiem against the pleas of both the Chief and Cortana, and your AI companion has a lapse in self-control.
I will not allow you to leave this planet!
Cortana.
I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to do that.
Cortana's outburst is shocking and heartbreaking, a moment of instability that is now becoming all too common and showing just how badly she's degraded. And Del Rio is justified in ordering her decommission, but the Chief made a promise to find a way to save her, and he is duty-bound to protect humanity. But when his sense of duty is being actively subverted by the chain of command, one of the two has got to give, culminating in this legendary exchange.
The Didact has to be stopped. If you won't do that, I will.
I am ordering you to surrender that AI!
No, sir.
Lieutenant! Arrest that man!
Captain!
Arrest him!
Captain!
As amusing as Del Rio's outburst is, between the line itself, Mark Ralston's delivery, and the hilariously rubbery facial animation, his pathetic attempts to assert his authority only serve to further uplift the Chief's refusal to hand over Cortana. There's a stern confidence here that, despite Del Rio giving the order for the Chief's arrest, the Spartan isn't going to face any meaningful repercussions. Even the framing and blocking of the scene highlight the massive power disparity between the Chief and the Captain. Their exchange is shot mostly over their shoulders and with the camera tilted on its vertical axis to show the gap in height between the two, while keeping both of them in frame. The Chief towers over Del Rio and is shot from a low angle. Likewise, Del Rio is shot from a high angle over the Chief's shoulder. This is basic cinematography, but it is effective in subtly supporting the dialogue and narrative of the scene. Low angles imply dominance, especially when the subject consumes most of the frame. If the scene was muted, one could still tell who was in control of the situation purely by the visual language on display. This is accentuated further by body language. When the Chief explains his intentions, his head faces Del Rio while his body remains facing slightly away from him, implying a readiness to exit the situation. But when Del Rio does not disengage and doubles down, the Chief turns his whole body toward the Captain, standing tall and confident, digging his heels into the ground as he utters,
"No, sir."
And as Del Rio continues to lose his composure, the Chief completely disengages, ignoring the calls for his arrest and setting his focus on stopping the Didact, all while his leitmotif plays him off. It's, ironically, this commitment to his duty as a soldier, something he unconsciously sees as being separate from being human, that helps to bring out his humanity and reject the idea of being a machine. If he were a machine, he would have blindly followed Del Rio's orders. He would have handed Cortana over, left Requiem on Infinity, and the Didact very well could have succeeded in his plans. A good soldier acts like a machine. A good soldier does what they're told. A good soldier does their duty. But in this moment, these three ideas of what it entails to be a good soldier are incompatible, and thus the Chief is forced to break that metaphorical mold and make his own decisions. Lasky, in contrast to Del Rio, is much more gracious and flexible with these tenets. He's much livelier and candid with the Chief, and even defies Del Rio's will to covertly help the aging Spartan to stop the Didact. Within the context of the narrative and themes of Halo 4, Lasky represents the best of humanity, and by the end of the story cements his place as the game's Captain Keyes analog when he replaces Del Rio as Infinity's captain. He's a welcome face in the cast, a reasonable authority figure who bends the rules to do what he feels is right in order to protect humanity, the exact sort of encouraging presence that the Chief needs. His presence isn't more complicated than that, but to some fans, Lasky represented something much more divisive about Halo 4's storytelling. Science fiction and fantasy franchises are no stranger to the idea of an extended canon. Star Trek, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Doctor Who, you name it, and it's got novels, radio dramas, TV shows, comic books, cereal boxes, or ancient Mesopotamian tablets that expand the story, characters, or world to varying degrees. Halo is no exception to this, with Eric Nyland's novel The Fall of Reach being published in September 2001, a whole 2 months before the original game, and has since then been seen as part of the very foundation of Halo's expanded universe. And while this does hold true in many regards, this mostly only applies to works in the expanded universe. Over the first 10 years of the franchise's history, While there were plentiful books and graphic novels and such being produced that expanded on the Halo canon, there was a fairly distinct separation between those and the games developed by Bungie. That is to say, one could play the games and feel like they hadn't missed out on any important context. Of course, Halo 3 did reference Fall of Reach frequently during Cortana's messages, but it was done tactfully, in a way that players who hadn't read the book wouldn't even know it was a reference at all. The zenith of Bungie's separation between the games and EU came with Halo Reach, which many fans of the lore saw as a betrayal of the canon due to it directly contradicting the events of Nyland's original novel, which by then had been available for nearly a decade. Original Halo composer Marty O'Donnell brought this to the attention of Reach's director, who outright dismissed such concerns, caring not for what was done in the books and asserting that only the games mattered. A reasonable sentiment.
I will tell you what the Bungie I worked with philosophy was.
Okay.
And that is that there's nothing more important than the game. So everything is subservient to the game. Yep. We weren't in charge of any of the novels. We weren't in charge of the stories. We weren't in charge of any of that. And we also really didn't pay much attention to it.
Yeah.
Which is why this is exactly why on Reach, when we decided that we were going to tell a prequel story after Halo 3 and after ODST, Reach is a prequel to everything.
Yeah.
And so as we talked about what that prequel should be, I remember even saying, hey, I read The Fall of Reach. We're sort of, we're going against some of the stuff that's in there. And I remember Marcus going like, yeah, I don't care what's in there. It's like, we're going to make the game we want to make. And if we have to change, if we have to do the story, like the only canon for us was the game stories.
While 343 did patch up the discrepancies between the conflicting works once they were handed control of the franchise, this seemed to be the beginning of the pendulum swinging the other way. Since assuming control, it seems that 343 has made a point of holding every piece of Halo media in equally high regard, with one of the effects of this being the integration of expanded universe elements into the core games, often with little context for players who don't engage in the EU, which is to say, the majority of them. This is most egregious in Halo 5, but it started in Halo 4 with the new faction of Covenant enemies, Lasky, Infinity, and the Didact. Halo 3 ended with players under the impression that the Covenant had been completely eradicated, only to find them still kicking around in Halo 4. The explanation for what this faction is, what they're doing and why, comes from the novel Glasslands, released in October 2011. Nowhere in Halo 4's campaign is their presence explained beyond a throwaway line.
I thought we had a truce with the Covenant.
A lot can happen in 4 years. Either way, he's probably not alone. We should be careful.
This isn't the same thing as Johnson coming back in Halo 2, justifying it by saying,
"Sorry, Guns, it's classified." My ass!
And only explaining what happened in a book. Johnson was one of several random Marine sergeants in Combat Evolved who Bungie found funny because of his voice actor, Mike Scully.
Halo 4, I get a woman. I've been guaranteed.
And decided to bring him back because there was hardly a canonical through line for him by that point, outside of his encounter with the Flood. And they reasoned that away with Rule of Cool.
Hey, I'm not dying again! I only die once! Do you hear me? Hard enough coming back the first time.
Nobody questions this because Johnson was never important to the narrative of Combat Evolved, and fans find him to be extremely entertaining and endearing.
If your shields go down, find some cover, wait for the meter to read fully charged.
That, or he can hide behind me. For a brick, he flew pretty good.
Dear humanity, we regret being alien bastards. We regret coming to Earth.
And we most definitely regret the Corps just blew up our raggedy-ass fleet. Hoorah! When I joined the Corps, we didn't have any fancy schmancy tanks. We had sticks, 2 sticks and a rock for a whole platoon. And we had to share the rock.
But the Covenant were brought back after being the primary antagonists for several games, where the main goal was to defeat them and save humanity. And that goal seemed to have been attained by the end of Halo 3.
Truth and the Covenant, the Flood, it's finished.
It's finished.
For some, their presence here devalues the effort that went into finishing the fight back in 2007, but I personally don't find it to be all that egregious when pulling back a bit and looking at Halo 4 as a video game rather than as just a story. The Covenant are here to give the player something familiar to fight early on, before the Prometheans are introduced, They stick around so the game has a sense of variety in its encounters, which, as we've already discussed, isn't especially plentiful with the new enemy types. It helps that the Covenant's presence in the narrative is incidental at best. They don't drive the plot beyond instigating Cortana to thaw the Master Chief, and even that's indirect. Beyond that, they serve the Didact because of course they would. He's a god to them. From a narrative perspective, there are superfluous elements that could have been cut, but doing so would have made for a much less fun or interesting gameplay experience. It doesn't just end with the Covenant, though. The Infinity is also culled from Glasslands, and Lasky, while being created specifically for Halo 4, was introduced and fleshed out in Glassland's sequel, The Thursday War, and the live-action web series Halo 4 Forward Unto Dawn, both of which were released roughly a month before the actual game. And while Lasky and Infinity's presence in Halo 4 isn't particularly reliant on any of those works, they are symptomatic of a problem which truly rears its head with the game's villain, the Didact.
The Forerunners have returned.
The Didact has such little presence or explanation in Halo 4's narrative that his motivations and actual character feel almost entirely inconsequential. Even his name isn't properly given. It's a lucky guess from Cortana.
That Didact, he manipulated Infinity's signal to get us to release him.
He's a living, breathing Forerunner, and yet such little time is spent on who he is, what he's doing, and why, beyond the same tired ground of exterminating humanity. There is a massively clunky exposition dump around the game's midpoint that tries to explain the finer details, but none of the information is given room to breathe. Compound this with the game's terminals, which serve to explore the Didact's past with a librarian through a series of motion comics. The only way players would know about them is if they actively sought them out or stumbled upon them, but in the original Xbox 360 release of the game, these terminal videos weren't even on the disc. They didn't play when the player activated them, like they do now in the Master Chief Collection. They merely unlocked the video on the Halo Waypoint app, which players could only open if they completely exited the game. This was done to save on disk space, which was already constrained and necessitated a second disk to install data to the console's hard drive. But the consequence is that players needed to completely remove themselves from the game and its story in order to understand anything about the antagonist beyond the surface level. The Terminals, Cryptum, Primordium, each of these works was produced to help players understand and properly contextualize the Didact, and yet none of them were available where it mattered most. Josh Holmes even admitted as much.
I think, this was a character that really resonated with players. They really enjoyed him as a villain, but there were players that felt like his motivations were not clear. But what we allowed ourselves to do in telling the story was we brought a lot of those more subtle motivations that existed in the surrounding fiction and allowed those to bleed into the main story of Halo 4. And what that did was it created the impression with some players that they were missing the larger story if they didn't take part in the books or if they didn't watch the terminals.
For what it's worth, I do enjoy Halo's extended canon. There are fascinating and well-told stories all over it. It's just a shame that it started to be used as a crutch for 343's stories. Despite the underwhelming external conflict, Halo 4 is able to leverage its lead character's journey in a way that truly makes the most of what can be done with an interactive medium. Over the course of the campaign, Cortana's deterioration is handled in a way that is tangible to the player without affecting gameplay, a substantial improvement over Halo 3's attempts at interface screw. As she continues to destabilize, the Chief finds himself taking control of the operation and patiently guiding Cortana through her issues, resolute that he will find a way to save her and stop the Didact, even if he has to do it all by himself. Piloting a broadsword fighter is a fun introductory segment to the game's final mission, aping Star Wars' climactic Death Star trench run and accentuating through sheer scale just how monumental the situation has become, and more importantly, making the player feel just as small and alone as the Master Chief is now. The station he tried to evacuate has had his entire staff either killed or composed by the Didact, with the ensuing scene between him and Cortana having absolutely no music and minimal sound design to emphasize the dire circumstance and give the player a moment to catch their breath.
Are you okay? I monitored the data pulse. I could
hear them. What was left of them?
We need to move.
These people are gone.
And more will follow if the Didact reaches Earth.
This trench run is scored by the Chief's new leitmotif, 117, with the single horn in its beginning carrying the melody and reflecting the Master Chief's status as the lone crusader against the Didact. The full brass and strings sections join in the harmony as the Didact ship approaches Earth, and the newly promoted Lasky vows to help the Chief however he can with the aid of Earth's orbital defense grid.
Weapons! Prepare firing solution! We promised to get the Chief inside that ship, and I'm not about to let that man down!
He isn't alone anymore. He's got the support he needs. But of course, he was never alone. Cortana has always been with him, even if her rampancy has significantly diminished her operational abilities.
I'm sorry, I just can't stop them. It's like 1,000 of me arguing all at once.
At the last hurdle to bring down the shield protecting the Didact and the Composer, after the Chief plugs her in, she solemnly turns to face him and says,
I've got to do something you're not going to like.
Cortana turns her debilitating affliction into an ad hoc weapon in one final effort to help the Master Chief save humanity once again. But once she's brought down the Didact shield, the Mad Forerunner seemingly obliterates her before she can be retrieved.
Cortana!
It's during the final mad dash to confront the Didact that the Chief and the player begin hearing whispers in their ear.
Get to the core. Destroy it. Save them. Destroy the composer. We will light your way. We don't want to leave you. I'll always take care of you.
When the Didact has the Chief subdued and all hope is lost, the dozens of rampant Cortana fragments emerge from the hard light bridge beneath their feet to subdue the Forerunner, explicitly stating that she isn't taking a stand against him for the sake of humanity, as he believes. It's thanks to Cortana that the Chief is able to stop the Didact and detonate the nuke, with no plan or expectation of survival.
Our duty as soldiers is to protect humanity.
We can't let the Flood get off this ring. You know what he'd expect, what he'd want us to do. We did what we had to do. For Earth. Halo. It's finished.
No. I think we're just getting started.
For a brick, he flew pretty good.
Your pal. Where's he going?
Earth. To finish what we started. And this time, none of you will be left behind.
After I'm through with truth.
Don't make a girl a promise if you know you can't keep it.
Where is she, Chief? Where's Cortana?
On the other side, there's a solution. A way to stop the Flood.
I'll find Cortana's solution, and I'll bring it back.
But so much of me is wrong. You might be too late.
You know me when I make a promise.
You keep it.
Don't let her go. Don't ever let her go.
I was put into service 8 years ago. AIs deteriorate after 7, Chief.
If we can just get back to Earth and find Halsey, she can fix this.
I won't recover from rampancy, Chief.
I will not allow you to leave this planet!
I've got to do something you're not going to like.
Your compassion for mankind is misplaced.
I'm not doing this for mankind.
Get to the core. Destroy it. We don't want to leave you. We will light your way. I'll always take care of you.
Whatever the cost.
Only, he doesn't immediately burn in atomic fire. He finds himself enveloped in the very same hard light which has formed countless bridges and barriers on every Forerunner construct he's been to, the same hard light that Cortana used to give herself some corporeal presence to restrain the Didact, and now the same hard light that allows Cortana to see the Chief again, one last time, in a form as close to human as she can possibly be. Fans have criticized this climax for being silly, melodramatic, and uncharacteristically romantic. But given how these two have had to rely on each other for so long, almost exclusively, how Halo 4 unravels and inverts the bases of their respective characters and roles, and that this was written as a final goodbye, I more than give it a pass based on its masterful execution. And it's not just any one particular element. Halo 4 has been building up to this moment, and even the smallest details help to carry the weight of the story's emotional climax. The moment of silence and confusion, the slow realization, the physical space in the frame separating the Chief and Cortana. Steve Downes and Jen Taylor give their best performances as these characters in this scene, with Downes' reading of the normally undaunted, Clint Eastwood-esque super soldier struggling to keep it together, imbuing the Master Chief with genuine pathos for the first time, without compromising the character's stoicism, and Taylor showing just how human and artificial intelligence can really be. This is only possible due to the solid script, which successfully leverages these characters' history together to tug at fans' heartstrings. Cortana calling the Chief by his name is something she's only done once before in the games, at the end of Halo 3, when she was skeptical of their chances of survival.
It's been an honor serving with you, John.
Here, she uses it because she knows she isn't going to make it. She's already mostly gone. It's a subtle way for her to show vulnerability, while also trying to comfort the man who has spent years protecting and taking care of her, and she him. When John's emotional wall starts to break down, she places her hand on his chest, and while her dialogue clearly states that actually feeling him is something she's wanted to do for so long, she is made of light, and he is wearing a half-ton suit of armor. She can't actually feel anything, and neither can John. She puts her hand on his chest not so she can feel him, or for the Chief to feel her, but to comfort him, assuring him that they both fulfilled their duty to take care of each other, before leaving on a bittersweet note.
Wait.
Welcome home, John.
When I saw this ending for the first time when I was 17, I genuinely cried. And now, nearly 10 years later, I still weep. Halo 4's emotional storytelling is truly captivating in ways that the AAA space rarely aspires. It doesn't feel manipulative, nor does it try to write a check it can't cash. It bends the rules a bit, but only in ways which feel like a natural evolution of what had been done in earlier titles. And its score, while a departure from what had come before, is an absolute triumph. Tracks like 117, Arrival, and Green and Blue are integrated into the game's final mission perfectly, evoking an emotional response from me every time without fail, with other tracks like Awakening, Requiem, Mantis, and the midnight version of Never Forget, showing just how well suited Neil Davidge and Kazuma Junichi were to expanding Halo's musical canon. Revisiting Halo 4 after all this time has helped me to truly appreciate what it set out to do and what it gets so right. But despite what it does right, I can't say it's my favorite Halo campaign, but it certainly made me think about the one that is. While many of us fans would like to pretend otherwise, Halo has never really had a truly great or transcendent narrative to tell in any of its campaigns. But as I played and replayed Halo 4 again and again for this retrospective, I began to see similarities with the game that brought me into this franchise all those years ago. Both Halos 2 and 4 sought to expand the player's surface-level understanding of a faction from the previous games. In Halo 2, it was the Covenant, through the eyes of the Arbiter. In 4, it's the Forerunners, through the presence of the Didact and the Librarian. They also sought to tell compelling character stories, in which the protagonist experiences proper growth and development, with the Arbiter learning the truth behind the Covenant in Halo, and the Chief waking up to his latent humanity. But where Halo 2 succeeds, despite its cliffhanger ending, is in its holistic narrative. While the Master Chief and the Arbiter only have a single brief meeting in that game, their stories feed into and inform each other. The Chief's destruction of Halo in the first game led to Thel 'Vadamee being stripped of his rank and name, becoming the Arbiter, and being sent on suicide missions as penance for his failure. The Chief's pursuit and murder of the Prophet of Regret gives Truth the justification to replace the elites with the brutes, after which he subsequently gives Tartarus the order to kill the Arbiter when he's outlived his usefulness, along with the rest of the elites, thus starting the Great Schism, which sees High Charity erupt into civil war as the Chief guns it for Truth. The Arbiter begins to question his faith following his encounter with the Gravemind, and witnessing the brute's slaughter of his people. And when he hears Guilty Spark's explanation of what the Halo rings were built for and what happened to the Forerunners, he accepts this as the truth because it's coming straight from the horse's mouth. The Arbiter has a terrific foil in Tartarus. Like the Arbiter, Tartarus starts the story as a loyal servant of the Prophets, a believer in their covenant and the Great Journey. But whereas the Arbiter begins to question his faith over the course of the campaign, Tartarus is stalwart, single-minded, loyal to the covenant no matter what. When confronted with the truth, the Arbiter solemnly accepts it, dejected that he had dedicated his life to a religion built on lies and led by an oblivious fool, a vain patsy, and a manipulative charlatan with delusions of grandeur. And Keith David is able to bring this across beautifully with his delivery of a single line.
Tartarus, the prophets have betrayed us.
Tartarus, on the other hand, rejects this premise, headstrong in fulfilling that which he has worked all his life to achieve. The battle with the chieftain is not only a fight for the fate of all sentient life in the galaxy, but one of ideals, a duel between those who have seen the light outside the cave and those who feel comfort in the darkness they think they know. And while the fight itself is mechanically baffling and dull, and the cutscene that follows doesn't even acknowledge the brute's death, the ideas and themes are intriguing and tie the whole game's narrative together, again, setting aside the cliffhanger. While the Arbiter wasn't a well-received character by the fandom in 2004, he has since then become a fan favorite, with the announcement of him being in Halo 5 being met with universal praise. And although his actual missions in Halo 2 are often considered the worst parts of that game from a design and structure standpoint, the story they tell is now viewed as a highlight of the franchise. But Halo 4, despite its ambitions and even its genuine achievements in storytelling, doesn't quite reach that mark. Yes, the micro-narratives of the Chief and Cortana are the core of the story, and by far the best thing about it, but the external conflict with the Didact doesn't tie into their character journeys at all, besides simply providing an external conflict, giving the Chief a reason to disobey orders and temporarily go rogue, and setting up an emotional finale that, cheesy as it is to some, never fails to hit me hard in the feels. But the Didact's character, his motivations, his plans, none of it has any correlation with the Chief and Cortana specifically, and his character and presence don't reveal any sort of greater truth about our protagonists through their conflict. Seeing the Chief confront the Didact is nowhere near as interesting as seeing the Arbiter confront Tartarus, despite the Didact, in theory, being a potentially much more interesting character. It's also this disconnect between the micro and macro narratives which makes Halo 4's pre-rendered opening cinematic so infamous. Functionally, it fills in players who aren't familiar with the extended canon on the morally reprehensible origins of the Spartan program that produced the Chief. Thematically, it sets the stage for what Halo 4 is ultimately about, the Master Chief's broken humanity. Dr. Halsey sees her Spartans as the next step in human evolution, putting this story on the fringes of transhumanism, as do the very nature of the Prometheans, the Librarian's nebulous gift to the Chief that makes him immune to the Composer, and Cortana's very nature as a machine made to be human. But the events of the scene, Halsey's interrogation, aren't given any further context or follow-up, leaving many players feeling that the scene's inclusion is unnecessary at best and confusing at worst. On a thematic level, this scene is a fantastic way to open Halo 4, but much like the campaign's external conflict, what's actually happening in the scene doesn't matter much at all in regards to those themes, and the game doesn't seem interested much in doing otherwise. As it stands, this introductory scene is the perfect microcosm of Halo 4's greatest narrative weakness, and following up on this scene in Spartan Ops doesn't solve the problem. Not that I would know, I never finished Spartan Ops. Halo 4 may have given me a renewed respect for Halo 2, which remains my favorite Halo campaign, but that doesn't mean I don't feel more highly about 343 Industries' first outing than I had back in 2012. If the external conflict had tied in better with the characters' arcs on a thematic level, this story would have easily surpassed Halo 2 in my mind. But it wasn't just that narrative disconnect that held Halo 4 back. It was the frustrating new enemies, a multiplayer suite that chased trends as opposed to setting them, lackluster and downgraded community features, and the underwhelming execution of Spartan Ops, which sought to cater to both campaign and multiplayer fans by giving each group exactly what neither of them wanted in place of firefight. It's no wonder that most players, myself included, didn't stick with Halo 4 for very long, and that its population plummeted alarmingly fast for a Halo game. Halo 4 isn't a bad game. In my opinion, it isn't even a bad Halo game based on the strengths of its campaign. Unfortunately, its gripping character story doesn't make up for an uninteresting villain, poor pacing, and tedious enemy design, but it seemed to me, at least at the time, like 343 Industries was set to take the Master Chief in an intriguing new direction that Bungie would never have considered, and based on what they had done with him in Halo 4, I was ready to follow them on this great journey, and I'm sure I was far from the only one. And while the franchise has been dragged through the mud since then, with the disastrous launch of the Master Chief Collection, Halo 5's almost universally reviled campaign, and most recently the aggressive monetization practices of Halo Infinite's free-to-play model, I can surprisingly look back at Halo 4 and say, you know what? There was some pretty good stuff in there.